Well, it's a privilege to be here today. After that terrific presentation by Dr. Pepler, talking about the issues for children, I want to extend that discussion a little bit and talk about the experiences of families. And we have focused on both mothers and fathers as they navigate the autism journey. And I want to talk a little bit about that, but first I want to just recognize the team of colleagues, Dr. Wendy Roberts, who is here, and I think it's kind of fitting when we think about the community and working together and building capacity. In my mind, Wendy Roberts is one of those heroes in our community, a national treasure. Wouldn't you agree? And has had a huge part in this work, as well as much else that goes on in our autism community. I also, at your tables, you have this brochure that's entitled, "What Will It Take? Advancing Vocational Opportunities for Persons with Autism Spectrum Disorder." And I bring that with colleagues who are here today. Mark Spoelstra, Deborah Pugh. Mark is, everyone knows Mark here in Ontario. And Deborah Pugh, who is from ACT BC? Autism Community Training in Vancouver. And Teresa Severia, who is in Regina. And a committee, and Cynthia Carroll, who is with Autism Nova Scotia, all who are here today. And us and a committee who have been working on this in bringing together our community to think about what would it take to build opportunity, increased opportunity in terms of moving beyond high school into the adult years and thinking about what could happen if we were the welcoming community that we want to be. And I was thinking about that as Dr. Pepler was talking this morning. So we want to invite you to that conference. I want to say thank you to Autism Speaks Canada. Jill Farber is here, and for their support of this meeting, and also NeuroDevNet and the Sini Family Foundation. It's a wonderful thing when we come together as a community like we are here. So and say, what can we do to make a difference? And I love Dr. Pepler's words when she said, it's about us working together in new ways. So Jonathan, thank you for your work, and to all of you for bringing this community together and working towards change. This work that we're doing is really broadening the lens to say, sometimes in our communities we say, what is wrong here? And in the common discourse, sometimes that equates to things like, what is wrong with that child? And I wonder if we need to change the question. And I think Dr. Pepler pushed us this morning to say, maybe we need to broaden our question to really be not a bullying question, not to bully, but rather to say, what is wrong with our community that prevents us from being the welcoming place that it needs to be? And that's kind of what drove this experience, to think about more broadly in terms of the family. What is the experience of families, and more specifically of mothers, who are often in the trenches doing whatever it takes to seeking to make it work for her child? And so Wendy and others in our team have been spending some time, and we actually have interviewed 85 mothers all with a child with autism, and these are mothers in 2 Canadian provinces, Ontario and Alberta. And we also spent time in the homes of these individuals, and they generously, many of them, allowed us to just spend time observing the homes and in their communities and their natural settings. And our study really looked at a broad range. So preschool children, less than 5 years old, elementary school, high school age, and then youth transitioning into adulthood, so age 18 to 25. So there was a wide range in this sample. And when we observed and we talked to mothers, we found some unique and I think extraordinary roles that mothers, particularly mothers of children with autism, grapple with. And here's some of them. First of all, being a vigilant monitor and anticipator. So being a scanner of one's environment and thinking about where are we going and what could happen. Sometimes that might be what could go wrong. And how do we anticipate that and forge that experience and maneuver the environment or the situation or the players or whatever it is to create success in that moment. So a constant thinking and anticipating. Secondly, an interpreter of needs based on a nuanced understanding of the child. So thinking about fit in terms of the child and the environment and what needs to happen. Being a problem solver, being a supervisor and coordinator. So in varying degrees, mothers were the entrepreneur of an enterprise in terms of managing service providers and trying to get services, sometimes with great difficulty. And then managing all those pieces and trying to navigate, and when things did not go well, I thought of that example this morning of bullying. When those things happen, seeking to navigate that, often with the struggle to find the resources to address those issues. Parents described mothers in particular being an unending advocate for their child, sometimes telling the story over and over, and often also an advocate not just for their child with autism, but for the cause of autism. So being an educator in the communities and a great contribution to our communities at large in terms of expanding the knowledge. And beyond all that, mothers became de facto service providers. Sometimes because those services weren't accessible or available to the extent needed. So here's some examples. Dietary management, feeding, medication administration, ensuring routine transition management. So coordination. When in other areas of health, other issues, there would be coordinators of care that would really work towards a seamlessness of care, but that was often left de facto to mothers to navigate. And mothers became intervention providers and tried to manage that within the busyness and the challenges of everyday life. So when we see mothers of children with autism looking somewhat exhausted or overwhelmed, it's not surprising. And when you think about that, so what are some of the experiences that mothers talked about in terms of the tremendous regard and love for their children? So love, yet loss and sadness at multiple levels. And I'm going to talk a little more about that. But some of the tensions in raising a child with difference in a community that may not be very friendly. And what that means and how mothers seek to buffer the blow and create environments that work as best as they can for that child. Mothers talked about confusion and anxiety and fear as they embarked on this new world called autism. Often with little understanding and background of what that meant, yet they became de facto students in the School of Autism and gained as much as they can. But we know that the navigation of that information is vast and confusing. And you know where mothers often went to get that information? Any ideas? other mothers, the internet often. And if you Google autism, you get a wide swath of perspectives that may be helpful, maybe not. The question is, what do we take in? What information will we choose to follow? What is the cost? How do we access those resources? All those complex pieces. So anxiety, fear, lots of work. But over time, mothers talked about gaining confidence. It didn't make the job necessarily easier, but they began to understand some of the terrain that in the beginning was so new. Mothers talked about developing a new sense, a new norm, in a sense, in the context of their life and in families' life. And part of that was appreciating the victories that many others took for granted. So those might be things that came along, working on a skill, working and working and working. And finally, that child is able to master that. And what a wonderful celebration that is for that family, for that mother. So it's that sense of gratitude for those victories that sometimes we gloss over as not very significant. But mothers also talked about that notion of gratitude, but at the same time, that notion of sort of continually looking over their shoulder, saying, what's going to happen next? The challenge of continually running into obstacles and seeking to find answers that sometimes weren't there, or seeking resources that were difficult to get. And so while those victories were sweet, they sometimes were very short-lived because the problems, the next problem lurked around the corner. Yet realizing the gains and the uniqueness and specialness of that young person in their family with autism. Mothers were absorbed in varying degrees, but often extensively, in day and nighttime care. So the issue of sleep deprivation emerged strongly, and when we think about some of the sleep issues, so the challenges of the daytime, but also nighttime for some families. Exhaustion, decreased social contact, and shifts over time. So I think sometimes in our everyday discourse about autism, we think about autism as this static entity, but actually families adapt and change, and children and young people and adults with autism move forward. And families navigate this terrain and move forward and adapt as well. And I sometimes I think we need to think about this not as a single point in time, but rather more broadly. Some of the tensions that came along. So in early days, this example, mothers talked about in some cases the very instance of what was viewed as positive. So in this case, signs of ASD early on appear that the child is developing skills quickly. So there might be a child who is really good at lining up their cars, for instance. And a parent looks at that and says, "Look at that skill! Isn't that cool?" And what a gifted little guy or little girl. Only to be told that is a marker of autism, and in some ways used to talk about in sort of a deficit language. And mothers talked about how they could never look at that skill again without a tinge of a whole change in perspective. And it began us thinking about the tensions, the margins. This morning we heard about children on the margins. And we've grappled with the notion of families on the margins, of the tensions, the dilemmas, the binaries, as we are often geared to be a fairly cookie-cutter world. And families, where there is difference, can be systematically excluded to the margins. I was thinking about that very strong language of bullying. and how deplorable it is when we think about bullied children. And it made me think about, what does it mean to have bullied families? And that might be too strong of a word, I don't know though, when people are systematically excluded and marginalized and pushed to the margins. Some of the tensions that families talk about are, in terms of some of the margins that emerge in autism, are the notion of ableism and disableism. And what do you do when a child looks normal but may not present as normal? And families are faced with that experience when they go to public places like the mall. And the message, maybe overtly or covertly, is, what is wrong with your parenting, right? And another challenge, a binary, a dilemma for families, is this notion of independence versus dependence. So the challenge of, examples would be, as we think about transitioning, as that aim of moving people towards increased independence, when some of the challenges related to autism call for ongoing dependence and support. And is there room for somewhere in between? Do we have those places in our communities, in our society? Mothers talked about this notion of caring about, of loving. Caring for one's child, caring about is equated to what I've called caring for, or extraordinary care for, no matter what the cost to that mother. So mothers had made all kinds of adjustments in their lives. And if we think about the resources in our communities, thinking about what kind of seamless wraparound supports are there or aren't there, the one that buffered that often was the mother. Is that any surprise to people here? And no matter what the cost, and if mothers did not do that, did not figure a way to navigate that in the midst of career and other family and other responsibilities, let alone any time for self, the question became, what is wrong with that mother? Again, what are the questions we're asking? What do we problematize here? Is it about the individual? Is it about the family? Or is it about our communities? And do we need to do things better when we think about how we orchestrate and navigate services? And then mothers were continually grappled with the need to support the child versus challenging social and environmental structures, pushing for change. And when I look around our communities and I see some amazing work going on in various places, I don't need to look very far before I find some mothers at work. It's not true. Along with many others that come and work together and champion the cause. And I'm so grateful for that in our communities. But mothers struggled with how to navigate limited energy and that tension of what battles to take on and how to make that work, not just for her own child or children, but also how to make our communities better places. So living on the margins, we encountered in our work multiple areas. Issues of when ASD, autism, manifests itself, what do we think about? Is it the autism as it's emergent in that situation, as that child is navigating sometimes complex sensory environments and unfriendly social spaces? We just heard about bullying. What is that effect? Versus sometimes what we label in our common parlance as poor parenting. And I think we really need to push back on some of that. Parents struggled with the notion of to tell or not to tell, to disclose the diagnosis. And in our particular sample, there were families on both ends of that spectrum, and had multiple arguments to tell or not to tell. And one of the issues was disclosing a diagnosis of autism was seen as a gateway, hopefully, to services and to some understanding in our communities. But mothers also were concerned about how that label could be misused. And in some cases, how everything else it becomes looked at through the purview of autism. So can that individual access mental health services if they need them? Or is that glossed over because what we see is autism and not the complexity and the dynamic issues that are at play? Mothers worked vigilantly to access services. So the tension there, the binary is that the need for services, and even our language around services is there's a window of opportunity, as if at some point that window is going to close. Think about the pressure upon families to get those services quickly. Yet those services are not available, or they are put on waiting lists, or all those things that happen in terms of excluding or of making it difficult in terms of the seamlessness of the system. And you know, lots of attention needs to happen there in terms of accessibility, and there's some good work pushing forward, and I'm glad to see that in place. The notion of inclusion and exclusion at all levels, and I was thinking of that talk this morning on in the schoolyard, but also in other spheres of life and across the lifespan, and what that means. Mothers grappled with attending well and continually to the needs of their child with autism, yet fitting that within the other responsibilities of their lives. And the pervasiveness yet invisibility of autism, and all that means, and the challenge of that, and the lack of understanding, versus the multiple questions in terms of best approaches, and how do we move forward with that. And then the last sort of binary or struggle is planning for the future, planning for the unknown, and what that means. And particularly became an issue, a new issue, as people moved from the sprint in early days of autism to the marathon of autism, and thinking about how will my young person be supported even beyond my lifetime, and what does that mean? Yet through it all, families navigated, and the resilience of families needs to be recognized and celebrated. And when we think about this process, this journey, the fluidity of this, this is kind of a picture as people walk into parenthood. That's kind of how it was presented. So parenting as it's experienced and practiced, how we do parenting, how we experience it. And often when a child enters our life, what a beautiful occasion that is. And it happens in the context of celebration in terms of social life. It becomes part of we start to associate with other young families and community integration. There might be early intervention stuff and play dates and all that kind of thing. So extended family gets involved, excited. And so you see that sort of loosely coupled, the dotted line speaks to the porousness, the openness of the family within that larger social world. So friendships, child-related community connections. So when we think about that growing child, we think about things like birthday parties and play dates and peer relationships as that child moves into adolescence, all those kind of things. But autism, what mothers talked about was how autism usurps some of these other areas of social life and community integration, extended family. The community may or may not be very welcoming to that individual with autism. And so the doors may open, or what we heard more often was the doors start to close. as autism is seen to take a bigger role in terms of how welcoming is one to having a family come where someone will come and look in all the closets of the home. Or that was one example. When things are not quite cookie cutter, how open is the community to difference? And so various parts of social life, of community life became affected. And parents talked about, in varying degrees, this certainly wasn't everyone, but I think it's a concerning issue. And remember the question we raised is, how do we become welcoming communities? So this notion families started to, that dotted line that was open and porous becomes more, it becomes solid and more closed, or a cocooning effect. Outside boundaries become solidified, and in some ways, as families are pushed out, or we could argue are pushed inward, and the community is out there but not as welcoming. So social life, community, all those issues are not as much there. And families talked about this notion of struggling with us against the world. So again, where's the problem here? And the us becomes the people who are supportive, who have a sense of welcoming for the exceptionalities, but not as exceptions, but the diversity as the richness of that, what that brings. So if we think about who are part of that group that get it, that are supportive, it might be friends and family, it might be, mothers talked about finding strength in the autism community in some ways because others got it. Service providers as friends and providers, or service providers as friends or supporters, sometimes by default because other friends and supporters had dropped off. And again, I think an indictment on a question to myself about how welcoming am I, and realizing the richness that comes from realizing the relationship opportunity that comes when I see somebody beyond, who's not like me, but rather the richness of that. And as we think about what would it take to be a welcoming community, we need to ask some of those penetrating questions. So families created some of these boundaries, they told us, in order to buffer, protect against insult, sometimes just a protection or a reflection of a history of rejection, hurt, and pain. And they talked about the pain of seeing their child rejected. So we think about I don't know how you felt, but when I watched that video this morning, that was disturbing, wasn't it? Another layer of that is, what is the impact on a mother and a father and a family when they see their one who they love in their family being pushed away like that? And so it may not be so surprising that people create this cocoon around them of protectiveness. They talked about this seemingly setting up a semblance of control by guarding against those external elements that come against one. And elements that come with that on the right side, they're distrust, disillusionment, cynicism. So they might put that guard up, but there's a lot of stuff going on that reflects that pushback and rejection, hurt, anger, burnout. And the net result is increasing social isolation, which is not where we want to get to as a community. And I argue it isn't where we need to be. It isn't what we should be doing. The interesting thing in this work is that shifts happened over time. And I think this is a message of hope and challenge for us all, yet an indictment on us as we think about who we are as communities. One mother said, in the beginning it hurts and it upsets you. You want to fix it because you think it's broken, speaking of autism. And then as you live it, you come to realize it's just part of who the person is. And then you know you have to accept it and live with it and just try to do your best. Mothers talked about moving from a sprint to a marathon and navigating a world that in some cases shifted over time. Sometimes not, though, and that's what's concerning. But here's the shift. So remember the caption in the previous slide was us against the world, and here's where some people navigated to us within our world. And that solid boundary becomes more porous, more dotted, and a new normal emerges in terms of parenting, that parent experience, that process of parenting, and some of the shifts that happen over time. And I think this speaks to the resilience of families to navigate these complex waters. Stability in families happens to some degree. Yet remember that earlier slide where celebrating the victories but constantly looking over the shoulder of what's happening next. That it's that tenuous stability. Non-supporters, those who are not helpful, are often over time weeded out or dismissed, or somehow people find the thick skin to grapple with the insensitivities in their world. More resources and connections come with time as people start to increasingly find those who do make a difference, those champions that probably many of whom are in this room that make a difference. Learning to live in ambiguity, so realizing that the questions, the pieces, don't come to some quick fix answers, but grappling and learning to live within that. The battles become more carefully determined. What battles can we take on and what do we just let go? And see the tenaciousness, the resilience of families. It's an amazing thing that we need to recognize and celebrate and support. Celebration of victories and the appreciation of the specialness of that young person with autism and their siblings and the family. And I don't think we talk enough about that, and recognize that, yet not gloss over the very real challenges that face families day in and day out. I want to just spend a couple minutes, and I'm almost done here. Thank you for your attention to this. The issue for couples, so we spoke with mothers, and then we spoke with fathers, and then we talked to couples together. And what we found was, in a sense, three different stories. As mothers, fathers, couples, and sometimes co-parents, so divorced families or blended families, navigated this unknown terrain. And there were issues that emerged that somehow appear to give some strength to navigate the tensions in the social world. And one of them is the fit of roles within couples. And we found a sort of interesting notions of, in some families, there's a real, what we've called a complementarity, where one parent, maybe the mother, will have a specific set of roles, a father, another set of roles, and never the twain shall meet. Versus at the other sort of end of the continuum is a symmetry where both parents kind of pick up and do all the various tasks, and it's whoever happens to be there at that moment. And then there's lots of range in between. Where that became challenging, it becomes challenging at many levels when you think it was often mothers who did a lot of the hands-on work. Not always, but when it became really problematic in terms of the description of mothers was when that scenario did not fit with who they saw themselves to be. So there was a dissonance. And I wonder if that calls for us to think in new ways about how do we fit services to the needs not only of the individual but the family in terms of navigating that, thinking about what is it to be seamless in the services that we offer. Where we came to was the degree to which we find seamlessness in services or the lack thereof speaks to struggles within families. And I think it calls us to rethink about how do we work in terms of assessing needs and matching needs to services in a dynamic way, and thinking about coordination of services in new ways. I think I'll just move to my last slide here, which is really saying, where do we go with all this? And just a few recommendations. First of all, I think we need to listen to parents in a very deep way. And we hear notions of that, of person and family-centered care, but we can also become pretty dismissive of families. And mothers talk about getting that message overtly or covertly, saying, on the one hand, you know your child best, versus that sense of, oh, you're just the mom. And I think that we need to really look at our services and ourselves as professionals and say, how do we work as teams together in new ways to recognize the various roles that are brought to the table, and how do we do that well? And how we best support families may vary across family needs. We need to look at multiple areas of marginalization. So when we think about families that are have socioeconomic barriers or cultural barriers, or we think about the shifts over the life course and what that means in terms of changing family needs. Coordination of services, we've talked about that. The shifts over time, I think, invite us to think about periodic reassessment, but parents stressed to us, that assessment isn't just for telling the story and assessing, but if assessment doesn't turn into action, it's yet telling one story one more time in order to not be listened to. So they urged us to say, don't just have us tell the story for no good reason. We've told that story so many times. And lastly, I think I end sort of where we started and where Dr. Pepler got me thinking this morning, and that is thinking about what would it take to be the communities in Canada that we want to be, to realizing the richness of our mosaic, and coming to the point of saying the communities are communities for all, and that includes individuals with autism and their families. Thank you.